I think every week we should just lead the show with the E's NXT report, and we can just report on E's very, very biased, very one-sided, very certain superstar-centric reports on NXT. Because my man's keeping me informed on NXT to start the chat every day. The rest of you should join him, though. The rest of you should get in on the chat, give some suggestions what we're going to talk about for the next little while. What's up, Fernando? Yeah, E, I was late. And you know what I was doing? I sat here and then I started scrolling on my phone as if I didn't need to start the show, which was a really dumb thing for me to do. But that's kind of how it turned out. So that's what that is. Yeah, you know what, E? I like that. Send a super chat so I can get a watch. No, that's not a crease on my arm for where the watch would be. Just send a super chat so we can get a watch. What's up, Jeffrey? I have no idea what you're saying there, bud, but something about Netflix, WWE, ECW, 2025, and WWE SmackDown. Anyone could translate that for me in the chat, I would be more than grateful. What's up, everyone? As I haven't mentioned so far, I am Rob's MV. As you can see down in the corner, spelled exactly like that. This is the Nocturnal Knockout, a brass ring media podcast. What's up, guys? Okay, it's translated. It's true that NXT and SmackDown are coming to Netflix. I don't know. No idea on that one. They already air on Netflix in some countries, but not quite sure on that. No, E, what happened? What did Mr. Kennedy have to say? Anything interesting? I haven't caught up on a ton of news today. I've just been scrolling through to see if anything really major has broken. In terms of interviews the last few days, it's been more Whole Line of Black. I know the Hardys were on with Helwani today, but I haven't really recapped any of those interviews. Let me know if there's anything significant in that. Maybe we'll talk about it. Maybe we'll give it a little bit of space. As I mentioned, I'm Rob. This is the Nocturnal Knockout. We're going to have a little bit of a shorter show today. I got to run a little bit earlier today than normal. So we could go full length, but we may cut it a little short. So just going to be one topic today. No slides, kind of unplugged, bare bones, Nocturnal Knockout. Kennedy. Back in the day, I was all in on Kennedy. I thought he was going to be like the next star. There was a time when I distinctly remember thinking that Kennedy and MVP were going to like restart the next boom in wrestling. And I thought those were like the superstars that were in best position to do that. Oh, interesting. I'm sure Kennedy's got some great stories about a really, really awkward time in WWE because Kennedy's there pre the big scandals in the mid 2000s, and he's there very directly for the fallout. I want to say he was a Signature Pharmacy guy, or it might have been Signature Pharmacy. It was one of those other ones, but he was caught up in all that scandal, and that's all that time when all that was going down. There was congressional investigations that kind of went nowhere. Cena and Randy got him fired. Well, Orton definitely did, right? With the suplex on his shoulders that week. You guys remember that week? That has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but this is Nocturnal Knockout. We do whatever the hell we want. The bosses never watch. That week was wild because it was like Kennedy was back and he's a member of the Lakers, because I think that was the same week where they had the issue with the arena in Denver with the 2009 NBA Finals, and they ended up being double booked with Raw. And so if you remember, they pivoted and parodied the NBA on Raw as they pivoted to LA. I was LA and Denver in the series at the time. And in the big 5-on-5 match that they had to culminate, the big Lakers versus Nuggets match, Kennedy was in that, right? He was like the big surprise entry. There was all kinds of hype on it. And by that Friday, he was gone. He was done for. He suplexed Orton incorrectly in that match. on those shoulders that are a little rough. If anyone knows about any truth to what Jeffrey is saying in the chat, go ahead and share it with us. You can report it, and that'll be your news you're reporting. But if someone brings me something, I'll throw it in the Google machine. Yeah, 2009, 2010 is the late 2000s, early 2010s before like 2011, I would say. I think 2011 kind of marks a certain modern inflection point in WWE history that we can sort of go off of right now. I think right now is I think it's not perfect to say that. I think it's a little bit later, but you could say like the seeds of where we are now were kind of planted and yielded in 2011. We're going to talk about that actually a little bit with our what we're actually here to talk about. But that time is super weird because your post attitude, the newness of the ruthless aggression era has kind of worn off. So we're settling into those guys. And God, there's such a big generation gap in that whole generation. It's interesting to me that a lot of those guys are just now kind of finding their footing years and years later. But that's what the creative was. That's what the booking was. The wrestling landscape was back then. Those were some tough times. Speaking of tough times, that's what I want to talk to you guys about right now. How you guys feeling about current WWE? I think next week we're going to talk a lot of AEW. I know we traditionally don't talk AEW on this show, but it's kind of reaching a point right now in WWE where I'm having trouble figuring out where they are. And by proxy, I'm having trouble figuring out where you guys are at. So that's why I need you guys to tell me where you're at with this. What's up in WWE right now? It's no secret or breaking news or hot take to say that they are in a bit of a creative slump. I mean, thanks for that clarification, E. If you go back all the way, I think, to the Rumble, that's where it starts. It started with the Jey Uso win. And not that was necessarily the worst thing, and that's not what killed the company. I'm not going to put that on Jey. I'm not going to start a big old snowball of Jey hate on a little afternoon nocturnal knockout. That's not what I'm looking to do. But I think that sort of represents the end of whatever the kind of exciting boom that WWE was in. Not that it was necessarily exciting in the fall, but this is the time period where I think, as Fernando in the chat is so astutely saying, the honeymoon with Triple H is over. We're not judging stuff automatically as being good just because it's in contrast to the way things were under Vince. Like, we've sort of normalized ourselves into this WWE and have our own standards now, I think, for the Triple H era. So I think what Fernando said there is absolutely relevant. And for me, I'm kind of at the point where it's just very, very average on WWE television right now. Like, when you watch Raw this past Monday, it was not a bad episode of wrestling television. There was plenty of good stuff on the show, and I thought it was, a fairly entertaining watch if you're just sitting there out of context watching a wrestling show. I haven't seen any spoilers for SmackDown, but given the SmackDown's back down to 2 hours, I have no doubt that show is going to improve. With that said, everything's just kind of average. I heard another podcaster say everything was just been kind of mid this year. And that's exactly how I feel right now. Again, nothing is terrible. Nothing feels like they should be going out of business. There is the issues that I think TKO has brought in that have been very, very obvious this year, and I've been brought to the front. And let's face it, these kind of corporate issues or these issues of who's meddling and what only really get dissected by the fan base and analysts whenever the creative isn't cooking on all cylinders. If the creative was completely just doing well, we wouldn't be looking to see what the problem was of TKO, because there wouldn't be a problem necessarily to evaluate. But at this point, it's just kind of average. But with that said, there are times, and this is nothing new, but there are times where I think we get reactions. And I don't mean reactions in terms of cheers or boos. I mean the stuff that we're doing here on shows like this, on podcasts, on Twitter, on social media, whatever you want to call it, wherever the wrestling discourse by those of us who don't really have social lives or meaningful family lives or anything like that, and we just go ahead and talk about wrestling at a granular level all the time. People like that seem to have certain triggers in them that really just, regardless of the context of what's currently happening at the moment, there's just certain visceral reactions that internet wrestling fans seem to have. So today I want to identify at least 3 of those that I can identify, and that are pretty obvious ones. But I want you guys in the chat to do the same thing. So essentially, if that big old diatribe that I just went on is to make any sense for you, I'm asking you what things that aren't always bad at the time, but just in principle, do wrestling fans seem to react to very negatively? Wrestling fans online specifically, what do they act to very negatively, even if the current situation or the current example that they're reacting to isn't so bad? Now, what got me to think about this whole topic and this whole concept is some of the reaction I have seen recently to the match at Saturday night's main event. You know, come on, microphone. You know exactly what match I'm talking about. I'm talking about Goldberg versus Gunther. Now, I've tried not to, I've thought about saying this all day, and I've almost said Goldberg versus Brock like 30,000 times. Don't know why I'm doing that. But let's stick in modern times here. Goldberg versus Gunther. Now, according to the live audience, they seem to be very, very much into Goldberg versus Gunther. And I would say that a lot of what I'm saying and what I'm talking about is not relevant to the regular WWE audience. The audience that is there, the in-person audience, they're living everything these days. A lot of things, except for Miro versus Sheamus, are getting some reactions. CM Punk has had a hell of a week, right? Every emotion, every thought about CM Punk has been said and had, and it's a lot of negative feelings towards him for a variety of reasons have come to the surface, as they do every couple of years with the punker. However, you hear that crowd on Monday night. That crowd in Pittsburgh did not care about any of that. They do not care about CM hypocrite Punk. Absolutely not. They were just happy for him to save their heroes. What a stupid segment that was. The Punk Life segment was something else. Basic Punkonomics. That's a good point, Fernando. The build is for PLEs feel rushed, and some are taking too long to get results. Yeah. Punk and Seth have just been feuding for like 4 years. And I feel like that was the main event of the initial Netflix, like when we did that first sort of relaunch of the Nocturnal Knockout as a post show a couple months ago. Isn't that how we resolved that feud? And that's where we went to, and that feud kind of ruined WrestleMania, at least the build for some people, even though that match was probably the best match of that weekend, you can argue, or at least from a WWE perspective. And yeah, so this sort of mid-nature, I think anytime the product doesn't feel particularly hot, those of us who have been around for a while, who have been through some ups and downs, we start to go back on some things that we used to think that might not be relevant anymore, because it has been relevant in the past, because it has been something that has very, very much affected us in the past. And bringing it back to Goldberg and Gunther, obviously, I'm not going to fault anyone, myself included, for not being that excited to see a Goldberg match in 2025. No one's been excited to see a Goldberg match since 2017. And even that was more of a treat than something that was absolutely necessary. It was fun while it existed. And pretty much every iteration, except for when he was spearing the hell out of Dolph Ziggler, has been very bad since then. Well, Undertaker and him in Saudi Arabia is good for its own individual reasons, which we will someday break down, maybe as a farewell to Goldberg and some of his greatest moments. But when Goldberg versus Gunther is happening, aside from the criticisms of Goldberg specifically, Goldberg versus Gunther brings up what I'm going to call maybe the biggest piece of scar tissue right now that WWE fans have, and that is the idea that WWE is relying too much on stars from the past. Now, the most recent example, like I said, of this is Goldberg and Gunther, but I think you can also argue that whenever The Rock is around in certain capacities, that's also the same concept. Fernando's bringing up a good point. Sting was able to have a farewell match. Why not Goldberg? I think when it comes down to that specific, I mean, I agree with you in premise. I think the specifics is how much people like the person retiring, how people's opinion on the person that is retired. I think the opinion on Sting is one thing versus the opinion of Goldberg. Also, I don't feel like people thought in AEW that Sting was around kind of disrupting storylines and doing all this damage. So I don't think those are quite apples to apples comparisons, even though in the grand scheme of things, Fernando, I think you are ultimately right. But I think there's a good reason why the discourse doesn't quite go in that direction. Yeah, I would have loved to have seen Brock versus Gunther, but we were denied that last year. Now, I think the root cause of where the reaction, where people getting just so negative towards Goldberg, and specifically as WWE relying on the stars from the past, is because for about the last 16 or 17 years, until maybe the last year or so, WWE did nothing but rely on stars from the past. And we all know what we're talking about. We're talking about all the Rock comebacks that you randomly had happen. Fernando's talking about Stone Cold rumored to have one more match. That would be an example of such. Even though I think it was well received while it was happening when Sting was main eventing pay-per-views again. Goldberg's other runs that have happened, several runs of The Undertaker when Triple H was still active. Kane got tons of run well after his expiration date. And you look at that, it was years and years of the part-time stars from the past being tier one. Only John Cena was allowed to hang out with them. John Cena was the only one allowed to be invited into that tier. Versus tier two, who I just, in my mind, it's Dolph Ziggler. Like, I'm just thinking of regular guys that are there every week. It was those guys. And so that's where I think the concern comes from. But do I think it's a real cause for concern right now in WWE, current day, in July of 2025? I'm going to say no. Despite recent cause for concern with this, which I think has been very, very valid, it just doesn't happen as much anymore. I think that this is something that feels like it happens a lot because it happened so often in the past, and WWE fans were so numb to it that whenever we get any sniff of that again, it feels like regression, to be honest with you. It feels like you're going in reverse. So I completely get the feeling, even if it's not always 100% applicable. And I'm not just talking about Goldberg and Gunther here. I'm talking about the company as a whole. I think Goldberg and Gunther is the anchor point for that kind of discussion. For their part, like, WWE has proven that they can draw with their current top stars when they are the focus. And I know The Rock was involved, but in general, you think about like the Bloodline storyline and everything that was going on with Cody and all of that stuff, they were able to put the focus and make their guys the stars. They have that ability. There was some questions maybe in the 2010s and 2010s that maybe they didn't have that ability. Maybe they didn't have the guys. Maybe they didn't have the capacity. They just didn't book guys correctly anymore. So they had to rely on the booking they did 20 years ago. Counterintuitive as hell, but you get the logic there. That's not the case anymore. Again, like I said, throughout the past 25 years, you can argue that they needed those former stars. They don't anymore. They are simply a luxury, which is why the Goldberg-Gunther match doesn't hit me as hard as it does everyone else for a couple of reasons. One, it's on a Saturday night's main event. We can't go on every time that a Saturday night's main event happens and rant and rave at what an inconsequential Battle of the Belts-esque giveaway to NBC it is. So if that's the case, then why does it actually matter who's main eventing that show, where it's not that relevant of a show? Beyond that, let's face it, Gunther may be a pretty over character at times. His belt is not. His belt is a secondary thing. His belt is not important. And Gunther has really been the focus of any show for the past year or so. Even though he's been in an important spot, he's not necessarily the focus. So with all those things, I'm kind of nonplussed by this, although I would prefer it just not to happen because it is not really needed necessarily. I just don't think this specific instance is doing a ton of damage, and I don't think we have a WWE landscape right now that is completely subservient to stars from the past as we did in the past. So I think it's okay to be skeptical about this. It's okay to point it out, but I don't think we are awash in it right now. And I think what some of you guys are pointing out in the chat, yes, Umaga versus Gunther, if Umaga was still alive, would be very cool. I know I'm laughing when I read that, but that would be awesome. You mentioned like Ron Killings, and I think maybe you can argue that there's a bigger problem on the roster, and I don't think this is a problem. If you interpret this as a problem, that their roster is just older, even though they're homegrown or guys who have been there for a while. In the case like AJ Styles, he's been there for a while. Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes is sort of grown by them and nurtured elsewhere. Seth Rollins at this point, I think you count him as like a WWE guy, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these guys are, near 40 or well over it. And so when you sort of factor that into the equation and you realize your roster as a whole is a little bit older, that can present some issues. If you feel it presents an issue. Now, there was a time, 12 years ago when people would talk about older wrestlers, and some of the actual old timers like Steve Austin, these guys would sort of scoff back at those of us who thought a guy at 36 to 37 years old would be washed up in the world of pro wrestling. And I think historically there's been great draws like into their 40s. So I don't think that's a major issue unless you have such a big gap in talent between that older talent and the younger talent, and they don't ever intermix well. This is San Fernando. I gotta give you credit for this one. If Triple H never had a heart attack, he would be bringing himself back numerous times. 100%. He'd have had a match with Roman for the bloodline, right? To take out the tribal chief. He would have had a match with Cody over the chair bursting at AEW. Hell, he might even have a match with Good. He definitely would be having a match with Punk. That would 100% be on the table if he didn't have that heart attack. Now, I'm not going to say it was a good thing he had the heart attack, but thankfully we don't have to worry about that. No, nobody would rather see the Great Khali coming back. Nobody wants. I'll take Goldberg over Great Khali. I think Goldberg's a big star with a huge entrance. Yeah. I'm taking Goldberg over the Great Khali. Maybe we should send that match to Saudi Arabia. Khali Goldberg, 7-foot former champion, undefeated champion. Triple H being Cena's last opponent, it would have been great. He's got a WrestleMania history with him. Met him at 2 different WrestleManias. I'm the one you could never be, even though you beat me several times. I think it's turning into a Vince impression. I need to work on the game as I learned from The Rock, but then a little bit of that like Boston kind of accent that he works in there. Got to watch more Ringer podcasts to learn that. So guys, if you're worried about WWE being too over-reliant for the stars in the past, I don't think they're there right now. Now, the TKO of it all could absolutely change. The next thing, and again, I think all these are valid points of criticism, but they just may not always be valid at the time, or they could be perfectly valid, like the next one that I'm going to say is perfectly valid. So the other piece of scar tissue that wrestling fans seem to really have is the length of wrestling shows. Again, there is a reason for this. So recently, even on this show, I am celebrating the fact that it appears we're back to 2-hour SmackDowns. SmackDown has always been 2 hours. Even in the doldrums of 3-hour Raws, there's always a 2-hour SmackDown to rely on. How the hell Raw got shorter and SmackDown got longer? I'll never know. And as I talked about last week, this iteration of SmackDown, one of the worst of all the great, horrible eras of SmackDown, this was one of the worst. And I think a lot of us would attribute the poor output that SmackDown has had simply to it being a 3-hour show. That is where that turning point was. It's not like interesting stuff doesn't happen on there, It's not like good matches don't happen on there. It's just we have a lot of full entrances. We have just a very, very expanded out show. Thankfully, it's come to an end. But anytime we have an expanded wrestling show, we're going to have a reaction to it. This is also the case, I think, on the other side. And again, I haven't talked about AEW much in the last couple of weeks, and I think in generally they're doing really well. But these AEW pay-per-views are massive marathons. It is talked about every single time. In this era, in fact, where you can argue that WWE pay-per-views are too short, people are actually starting to make that argument, and you get it because you want more value than 4 matches. You had more this past weekend at Clash of Champions because the Saudis pay a little bit for an extra match or two, but still relatively tight. And again, I am not complaining about that as much. Like if I have to take the two of them, the marathon AEW pay-per-views or the bite-sized WWE shows, I'd probably take like the bite-sized WWE shows with the super energy from the best parts of the AEW shows. That would be the ideal mix. So, but regardless, the length of wrestling shows, it affects wrestling fans. It is something that there's legitimate scar tissue for. And we know what this is from. There is one source of this. It is 3-hour Raws. I don't know who can do this kind of study or hack it. Maybe like the guys that were studying Tony Khan's bots that were supposedly causing him hate a couple of years ago. That guy. I need Tony to give me that guy's phone number. Put it in the chat, Tony. I know you're watching. You watch every piece of internet content that is made about you. So put it in the chat, Tony. Put your phone number. Too many wrestling shows. That's a good one. That's a really good one by Maria, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, Tony, give me your guys. And I need these guys to commission a study for specifically what, tease out all the other variables, but what 3-hour Raws did to WWE programming for 15 years. These things were horrific. And I was doing post shows pretty regularly a couple of years ago, like with Wade Keller, and it was just, I got to the point where I realized I could never give a Raw episode a good review. It was impossible. Raw could be the best show ever, and I don't care what it is, sitting through a weekly 3-hour wrestling show wasn't it. And by association, drove everything down the show, drove the discourse down the show, drove the live audience down. Everything was horrific from those 3-hour Raws. Remember how funny it used to be when there'd be a 3-hour Raw prior to 2012? They'd be announced a big 3-hour Raw. So it's like, okay, this is like a pay-per-view Raw. I gotta see this. And then it's like, after 2012 happens, every week is one of these, and it's never special. And then you're starting to get you start getting premium live events that are clocking in almost under the length of a regular Raw with those 9,000 commercials. And it simply was too much. Now, do WWE fans or wrestling fans more broadly still have to worry about this? Abso-freaking-lutely. Even with the 2 WWE shows going down to 2 and 2.5 hours. There's several devils in the room on this one. Let's face it, as long as there's a demand for wrestling on TV, there's going to be an incentive for more wrestling on TV. Especially in the current media landscape where wrestling is one of the few things that people will still go to a television for. What's the incentive for a television network not to just take out their wallet the way USA has done over the years and throw a ton of money at WWE or TKO, I should say, in order to get more programming? And in this current era of corporate ownership with TKO, there is no doubt in my mind that if the price was right, as Nick Khan says, he wished Raws were 4 hours, that would absolutely be the case. So that's a little scary. Also, taking into a completely different way of viewing wrestling, you might want to say, okay, well, TV is kind of on the way out anyway. How much should we still, even invest in that emotionally or otherwise? Well, the other option is streaming. And you think it's bad on cable television where you can have overruns as you do now in AEW as well? Well, in streaming, there are no limits. And what's to stop one of these streaming companies to having the same exact calculation that WWE Network and Peacock had a couple years ago of, if we just make these shows super long, that really kicks up our watch time. So those guardrails are completely gone. I think we're very, very much in danger for massive wrestling shows returning And that's not a good thing. And as Maria pointed out in her post here, and I'll put this first one up here. Too many wrestling shows, period, for both companies. This is also definitely like, I mean, this next week, what is like 20 wrestling shows? Like there's a million wrestling shows. If you do a podcast, you do a preview podcast, you preview big pay-per-views, it's easy week for you next week. Easy week. You're just sitting back. This person's winning. That person's winning. This person's winning. Easy podcasting. Collect the checks. Send the super chats. Yeah, wrestling feels very oversaturated at the moment. And, for a while, wrestling was oversaturated and a monopoly. Now it's not necessarily that, but you're still getting a lot of wrestling right in front of you, to the point that I wonder about, like right now, I'm not watching a ton of ancillary wrestling as much as I used to. I rarely watch anything from Japan. If my son finds something on the indies that's kind of cool, he'll send it to me and I'll kind of check that out. There's a lot of wrestling, so there's a lot of chance to get burned out. Like if you want to be a hardcore fan, it's hard to focus on all this, and that's always been the case. But now it's coming even faster because the volume of shows, as Buddy has pointed out, has kind of even replaced the length of shows. So there's still too much wrestling, and it's wild, right? Anyone who's watched for a while can tell you, when you sort of cruise off of it, when there's been so much, you realize how much more accessible a lot of other forms of entertainment can be. So WWE, AEW definitely don't want us cycling off them for sure. All right, let's keep it moving here. Okay, now this one may be related to the first one, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it is relevant. And it is the age-old notion of WWE going with their guys over the guys and women that the fans seem to choose. Now, the most recent examples that I can think of this is anyone that we can associate as a TKO guy, whether that's The Rock coming in, whether it's Logan Paul coming in, whether it's all these influencers coming in, anything that feels very TKO centric, like a corporate sort of mandate. This person could be a star. This person automatically gets eyeballs, so they have to be put in a prominent position. Or Charlotte Flair. Now it's a little mean to Charlotte, but like she's an example that's more that I think really resonates, because this whole discourse is deeply, deeply rooted in John Cenaism. This is the John Cena cross to bear that was passed unceremoniously to Roman Reigns, until really you had a middle ground like Cody Rhodes to be both the fans' choice and a bit of a corporate choice. And it would seem that WWE has gotten a little bit better at this for the moment. Because when you watch the shows nowadays, it's filled with a lot of people in a lot of prominent spots that for years you would have said needed to be at those spots, or those are the guys you'd be advocating for. Think about how Sami Zayn right now, he's doing this feud. What's the name of the guy that's Killer Cross? Karrion Kross. His name just, his face popped into my. Maybe his star turn isn't going so well if I can't think of his name. Like he's involved in that, but in general, he's a top guy. He's a main eventer. When Kevin Owens is around there, he's a main eventer. He's a top guy. The Triple H peeps, even Bayley, you can argue she's not always in the focus. Like she's a focus though when she's on the show. The Bayley stands are going to hate that I said that, but I think it is true. So after a while though, those guys, if we realize, those are going to be the equivalent of the Vince guys, because those are all the NXT Triple H guys. Finn Balor, another example of this. And I think recently there has been a little bit of push-pull. Maybe that's why we saw it on Raw with LA Knight. Like for me, I thought LA Knight had his moment a couple of years ago. I thought his main event feud with Roman Reigns for that month or so, that was it. And then he was going to kind of settle into the upper mid-card range, which I think he was doing very well. But it seems like once again, he's almost hitting like a Zack Ryder, Dolph Ziggler kind of thing, where he's going to keep ascending to that top of the card. But are they going to make the change? Killer Cross is another one. Unless that one though, I've at times wondered if that whole thing isn't a isn't a big old corporate ruse, but I think we could say it's not. But those are examples of guys that it seems like the fans end up choosing, but they're not necessarily guys in the plans. Now, I think you give Triple H a lot of credit in that he, more so than Vince, he follows through on his plans. I think he gets much less bored with his own storytelling. In fact, he gets very enamored with his own storytelling. Maria puts in there, Stone Cold and Daniel Bryan are the only guys that forced the company to change course and push them. I think that's fairly true. I think there's other people that have made differences here or there. And even now, like a guy like CM Punk, that's finally getting like one of the major pushes of his career, probably the biggest one he's ever had, even despite being the champion in WWE. He comes in as seemingly one of their guys, even though he gets a great reaction from the crowd. He's kind of, I don't know if he's necessarily the choice. If that's a weird nuance that I'm splitting there. Is this something to be concerned about? I would say this one's a bit mixed. It's not as bad as before. Like, I don't think a bunch of lesser talented people, and I'm trying to tread very lightly because everyone in the company, all these time periods I'm thinking of in my head, I've been very good, very talented, and have been big stars. Got this house at WWE. I don't want to really disparage them there, but there was a time when it felt like, okay, the people at the bottom of the roster may be much better, and the fans, at least, again, the fans that are sort of looking at it from the frame that we're looking at, seem to care about those guys a whole lot more than the people at the top. And I think no matter who you are, I don't care if you're Triple H, Paul Heyman, Vince McMahon, Tony Khan, it does not matter. You're going to pick your guys. It makes sense. You believe you are smart. You have chosen these. You have identified these people. What do all these masses, all these plebes, all these losers, what do they know? Right? That's probably the attitude. And I don't blame it. I think it's a rational attitude to have. So I think the threat is always there. I think we don't know quite yet of Triple H's level of pettiness or lack thereof. I think there's been some good signs in that direction. There's also been some guys that he's kind of got cross with now. We'll have to see how it works out in the future with some of those guys. The guys that are cross with Triple H now, and then to see what that looks like a couple of years down the road. All that said, I don't think it's as big of a concern these days, is because I think Triple H actually runs more of that company, or his vision is more in alignment than actually Vince's was. What I mean by that is, like, there's not a lot of people getting on TV that don't have tons of focus to them. If anything, you could argue there's just a lot of people that don't get on TV. That, I think, is something that's very valid. They had Hikuleo for a year. We see Alexa Bliss and Aleister Black like every now and then, right? It's almost to the point, maybe Gable and Io Sky would be exception to this, where because of their structure, there's no one that you think should be better or that should be getting a push that's even going to get on TV. So everyone seemingly who's going to get a push or who fits the mold of what they want in that company right now are the people that they have. We take this back like 7 or 8 years ago in the super Triple H awesome NXT era. Triple H's vision and Triple H's vision of NXT was so drastically different than Vince's version of the main roster. Now, you can argue the differences between Shawn Michaels' NXT and Triple H's main roster. And I don't think NXT is nowhere near as good as it was back then when it had its own unique identity. But I think the alignment is so much stronger these days. I think you are so much more likely to get NXT guys who are stars in NXT to actually be stars on the main roster, something you didn't necessarily have at the whims of Vince McMahon. Again, this doesn't really say that the problem is going to go away. It just might not be a problem that seems so glaring, especially with the fact that you have another wrestling company now. And when AEW does it right, which they've been doing a lot right lately, it's when they present themselves as a contrast to WWE, not a light, lesser diet version of them. Now, but at the same time, there are still the Charlotte Flairs around. There's still the TKO guys coming around. So the guys are still around. So I'm going to call this about half and half. You don't need as much concern as you did 10 years ago, but you got to keep your eyes open. What about you guys? Those are my big three. I want to take a sip of water, and I want to hear from you guys. what pieces of scar tissue do you have? What things you just react to immediately, or if you see the scent of or the sign of, are you just a little warm inside, trying to type on that keyboard, fire Triple H, or what are the things that do that to you? I'm gonna take a sip of water. So E says Cena beating Kali with the STF. Is that because of the size difference and how wild that look, and then how they built that kind of around him putting that in? I think now, speaking of, someone put in the chat earlier, I think it was Fernando, about the honeymoon with Triple H being over, and I think that's been the case for a while. I wouldn't call it a honeymoon, but what would you call it, late marriage spark that everyone had with John Cena, that's gone. He'll still get the big reactions in the arenas, but all of the John Cena criticisms that were like dormant for the last 8 years, they all just feel so relevant again, don't they? With this hill run, they're all just bubbling like coagulating right back up to the surface. I guess we need Cody to be our savior. All right, let's keep it moving in terms of scar tissue. Yeah, I said that earlier, Azan, and I think that's the case. I think that's the end of like everything in WWE is pretty good. Even if some things are good, some things are bad. That was the end of that, and the hypercritical era, I think, has kind of started since then. Michael says every week of Gunther's title reign. How are you guys feeling about this title reign in particular? Has Gunther lost a little bit of spark for you with some of the losses that he had to take and being involved in all this, or the association with Goldberg? Is that what it is? Expand on that a little more, Michael. I'm actually interested. Okay. Fernando says Triple H thinking that putting both the men's and women's tag championships are going to get us to want Judgment Day, not to break up BS. We are still all tired. You talk about honeymoons being over, and someone mentioned this earlier. Judgment Day, like we're still like every week examining the failures of the Judgment Day, like as a storyline. Like even like in storyline, they're dead. It's Dominic and Liv are the thing that you can care about with them, even if everything else is interesting. Liv is on the shelf right now, and that group, let's be honest, it's fed off of those two strong female leads with Rhea and Liv, and the orbit of Dom. Obviously, Damian Priest had some good stuff, but to the extent that it ever was anything, it was Priest, Rhea, and Dom. Does anyone remember Edge starting the group? Yeah, I'm done with their tension too. I'm done with the weekly tension when we go back to the Judgment Days layer after the opening segment on Raw. It's very, very formulaic. All right, let's see what else you guys got in here. You guys have some good ones. E says, Mr. Kennedy getting fired and not being revealed as Vince's illegitimate son. Vince hires back a woman who sued him for harassment and stuff. Talk about Sable on that one. Yeah, poor. We'll talk about. Maybe we should do like the Ballad of Kennedy pretty soon, because we're getting into a lot of Kennedy sympathy. I think what was hard for me with Kennedy, as I said, I legit thought him and MVP were like the next Rock and Austin. That's what a great prognosticator I am. But then I don't know. Whenever he went to Impact, I was kind of like, I got him not getting a big push in WWE. Sometimes when the handcuffs are completely off, you get it. You apologize, and that's not even fair, because they were always generally wanting to push him until, as you said, until he ran afoul of Orton, and I was like, but him not being revealed as a legitimate son. There's a lot of people in wrestling, and I think some people were misled a little bit or under the wrong impression that Vince said I'm going to be the champ, or you got this plans. No, Kennedy, there's real plans for Kennedy for this major story that they kind of tried to do for like 5 years in a row with some form of killing Vince and the company going away. I think even like in 2016, that's what they were trying to do with that Undertaker Shane match. Some version of that. And for him not to get that, to lose the money in the bank that he had, and then 2 years later he's caught on a Wednesday for suplexing Orton wrong. What a fall from grace. I always thought it was Dom turning faces on. Finn is very unlikable in this role, like as a heel. I mean, obviously he's a very talented dude, a very good pro wrestler. So I don't know. I don't know if you can. I don't know how to pull that off. I'm very confused with Finn's character and how to get it into a good place, because I think Finn is suffering from something like Drew suffered from a couple years ago. Remember, Drew had that association with that horrible era that included Baron Corbin and Bobby Lashley. I think McIntyre struggled to sort of distance himself from that. This might be the biggest piece of scar tissue that anyone in wrestling has, and that he's putting out there. Shawn Michaels booking the breakup of the D'Angelo family. Yeah, that's been some tough times. Azan sees Dom as the babyface. You know, sometimes you guys. Let me catch back here. I'll put those chats back up. Sometimes you guys give me like one or two chats, some supportive stuff, and then I ask you, what are you guys unhappy about? And holy hell, it's just chat. So now I know what to do every year. I'm gonna crack open this thing and be like, what are you mad about this week? React. And this thing's just gonna fill up. Maybe it's just charged by the chat. Instead of asking for super chats, like every so many characters, you have to give me like 10 cents so I can get that watch that I don't have. I think you're talking about the lawsuit stuff. I think. I say poor Sunny. She's done a lot to herself, but it's sad what her life became. Oh, so Mr. Kennedy, he knows how to sell his podcast. He's saying if he gets 100K subscribers, he'll tell the details of his firing. Well, can you guys go subscribe to him? Like, make sure you're subscribed to me. Subscribe to Kennedy, and then we can hear that, and we can make summer content out of that. Dom and Liv Morgan are going to be mega over. They kind of already are. I assume you're assuming to them as baby faces. That might be kind of hard though. They're so people I think are invested in them as heels that it'll be easy for them to be invested in and care about them and cheer for them as baby faces. But I don't know. Maybe my brain has a hard time actually seeing what that looks like. The Miz firing, even though he made. Wait, is the Miz gone? Did the Miz get cut? I missed it there. Who? Oh, Kennedy. I'm sure you're Mighty. I think you're talking about why not write a book? I don't know if that would quite work as well. Like I've 10,000 subscribers and I will release this book. I don't know if that will quite work out the same. I feel bad for people who write books. Shout out to Zach Hader for writing a book. Buy his book. And Zach's book probably doesn't fall into this because like I was thinking about this the other day. I was buying I read a lot of like biographies. That's kind of my thing. And I'm sitting there reading this biography, thinking I'm going to have something that's going to be revealing and interesting. There's plenty of interesting stuff in the book, but it's like anything that was interesting got aggregated. So if I want an authentic experience of reading this book and getting these revelations, either I got to like block out the news cycle and read it 3 years down the road, or like the day it comes in on Amazon before the reviews have come in, I just got to read it all there and get the experience. I won't complain about reading books here. That's what you listen to wrestling streams, right? To hear guys complaining about reading books. Yeah, Miz. Yeah, I thought Miz had deleted some mentions of WWE from his account, but I thought that was all speculative. I thought Miz says he's even renewed for Miz and Mrs. Miz though, this is gonna sound like blasphemy to some people. When Miz's day does come, for as much like crap as the guy got for the majority of his career, I think it won't be as intense, but there will be a truth-esque outpouring for him. Maybe not that he needs to be brought back, because I think people are okay that like the Miz has like fully exhausted and exercised most of his talent into his career. But I think like the appreciation, the elation for the Miz, I mean, maybe is more what I'm saying. I think that'll crank up. Has he not been on television? That is interesting. You said Carmelo Anthony. I think you were referring to Carmelo Hayes. Unless they changed it to Carmelo. There's also another Carmelo Anthony in the news. It's really been confusing me because I've been like, oh my God, what is Melo involved in? Shows how close of attention I've been paying to SmackDown. Like, is the Miz gone? I don't know. It's in that 3 hour. It's in that 3 hour thing. Maybe is it Kyan Anthony? Maybe he can be the next great star. All right, guys. As I mentioned, this is a bit of an early night, in which I'm shaving off 7 minutes of the show. Really got to get there on time with that 7 minutes, but I am going to have to head out, so I apologize for the short, truncated, bite-sized show. Hopefully next week we'll get back to regularly scheduled hour plus, get the overrun back. But this week I do have to bounce out just a little bit early. But I want to thank you guys for all the chats today. That was awesome. This was one of the funnest chat days that we've had on here. So I like to keep the discussion going. Let's keep it going. Follow me on social media, Rob's MV. I may actually get on Twitter one of these days and respond if you send me a message. I'm also on Blue Sky, and I forget to check that because it's not as excited of a platform, even though there's good stuff on there. But I will talk to you guys next week. Enjoy some AEW tonight.